The wind screamed across the black cliffs of Jutland like the fury of a dying god. Bjorn Ironhand stood at the edge of the precipice, his weathered face carved by 40 winters of salt and war, watching the funeral pyre of his son burn against the storm-torn sky. The flames devoured the body of Eric, barely 16 winters old, wrapped in the bear pelt Bjorn had given him the morning he'd sent the boy to his death. The smoke rose in tortured spirals, carrying with it the last of Bjorn's honor, the last ember of the man he'd once believed himself to be. Around him, the clan gathered in silence, their faces hard as the granite beneath their feet, their eyes speaking what their mouths would not. This was his doing, his failure, his blood price yet unpaid. Eric had died 3 days past, in a raid Bjorn had commanded against the Dane settlement at Ravensborg. It was meant to be simple, a winter strike to claim cattle and grain before the snows sealed them in their valley. Bjorn had promised the clan easy spoils, had sworn on his father's sword that the Danes were few and unprepared, but he had been wrong. The intelligence had been false, whispered by a thrall whose loyalty Bjorn had bought with silver but never truly won. The Danes had been waiting, hidden in the mist-shrouded trees, their axes singing death before Bjorn's men could form a shield wall. 23 warriors had entered that cursed forest. 11 had returned, dragging their wounded and their dead through the snow that turned red beneath their feet. And among the fallen, pale and beautiful in death, had been Eric. The boy had fought bravely, they told him, had stood his ground when others fled, had killed 2 Danes before the third drove a spear through his throat. Bjorn should have felt pride in this. Instead, he felt only the cold certainty that his son's courage had been wasted, thrown away like grain to hungry crows because Bjorn had been careless, arrogant, too eager to prove his worth to a clan that whispered he was past his prime. He had sent Eric to the front of the formation, had placed him there deliberately to show the boy's mettle, to silence those who said the jarl's son was soft, untested. Now Eric would never be tested again. Now he was ash and memory, and Bjorn was the man who had killed him as surely as if he'd wielded the spear himself. The funeral rites ended as the sun died behind the western mountains. The clan dispersed in silence, returning to their longhouses and their own sorrows, leaving Bjorn alone with his wife Astrid and their daughter Freya. Astrid had not spoken to him since they'd brought Eric's body home. She stood now with Freya's hand in hers, her face a mask of stone, her eyes empty of everything but accusation. When she finally turned away, it was with a finality that struck Bjorn harder than any blade. She did not look back. Freya, 13 winters and suddenly ancient with grief, met her father's gaze for one terrible moment before following her mother into the darkness. In that look, Bjorn saw his daughter's childhood die, saw her love for him curdle into something bitter and broken. That night, alone in the jarl's hall with only the dying hearth fire for company, Bjorn drank himself into a stupor. The mead tasted like ash. Every shadow seemed to hold Eric's ghost. Every creak of the timber walls seemed to whisper his failure. He thought of his father, Halvard the Wise, who had ruled this clan for 40 years without losing a single raid, who had died peacefully in his bed, surrounded by sons and grandsons who would carry his name into saga. Halvard had given Bjorn the jarling 12 years ago, had placed the silver armring of leadership around his son's wrist, and told him that honor was not won in a single battle, but built stone by stone across a lifetime. Bjorn had squandered that honor. He had let his pride outweigh his judgment, had gambled with lives he had no right to risk, and now his son was dead, and his legacy was ashes. The council came for him 3 days later, as he'd known they would. 7 of the clan's eldest warriors, men who had fought beside his father, men whose loyalty was to the clan rather than to any single jarl. They entered his hall without ceremony, their faces grim, their hands empty of weapons but heavy with purpose. Thorvald Greybeard spoke for them all, his voice rough as grinding stone. The words were familiar from a dozen winter tales, the ritual language of judgment and exile. Bjorn had led them poorly, his arrogance had cost them sons and brothers. His failure at Ravensborg had shamed them before their enemies, and worst of all, he had sent his own son to die for pride rather than necessity, had placed personal glory above the welfare of his people. The punishment was inevitable, exile until the debt was paid. Bjorn would leave Hjaltland before the next new moon, would take nothing but his weapons and his shame, would not return until he had brought back something to restore the clan's honor. What that something might be, the council did not specify. That was for Bjorn to determine, for the gods to judge. He accepted the sentence without protest, without defense. What defense could there be? Every accusation was true, every word of condemnation was earned. When Thorvald removed the silver arm ring from Bjorn's wrist and placed it in the keeping of Arni Blackeye, who would rule as regent until Bjorn's return or death, Bjorn felt only relief. The weight of leadership had become unbearable. Astrid came to him the night before his departure. She entered his chamber without speaking, her face carved from ice, and for a moment Bjorn hoped for forgiveness, for some final word of comfort or understanding. Instead, she placed a small wooden box in his hands. Inside was Eric's first tooth, shed at 6 winters old, a lock of his pale hair from his naming ceremony, a crude wooden sword Bjorn had carved for the boy when he was barely old enough to walk. Astrid had kept these treasures for 10 years, sacred relics of their son's childhood. Now she gave them to Bjorn with hands that trembled not with grief but with rage. "Carry these," she said, her voice hollow as a broken drum. "Let them remind you every day what your pride cost. Let them weigh on you like the stones we placed on his cairn. And if you die out there in the cold and the dark, let them be buried with you, because that is all of our son you deserve to take into the next world." Morning came with frost and bitter wind. Bjorn left Hjaltland in the grey hour before dawn, when the world was neither night nor day, but something suspended between, a liminal space for liminal men. He took his father's sword, his war-axe, a heavy cloak lined with wolf fur, a pack of dried fish and hard bread, and the wooden box Astrid had given him. No one came to see him off. No one spoke blessings or wished him luck. The village remained shuttered and silent as he walked past the familiar longhouses, past the smithy where he'd learned to forge his first blade, past the sacred grove where he'd been married to Astrid under a sky full of stars. He did not look back. Looking back would have broken him, and he needed what little strength remained to carry him forward into the unknown. He travelled south through lands he'd raided in his youth, through territories that had once feared the name of Bjorn Ironhand. But that man was gone, burned away like morning mist. Now he was just another exile, another failed warrior seeking redemption in a world that had no use for his regrets. He avoided settlements, sleeping in caves and beneath fallen trees, speaking to no one, haunted by dreams of Eric calling for him in the darkness. The wooden box never left his person. He carried it against his heart, felt its weight with every step, let its sharp corners dig into his ribs until they left bruises. This was his penance, his private crucifixion. Weeks became months. Winter deepened its hold on the north. Bjorn wandered through Sweden's dark forests, skirted the edges of Danish territories, traded his silver rings for passage on ships that took him further from home. He heard stories in the mean villages and trading posts, tales of a great darkness gathering in the east, of a warlord named Ulfar the Bloody, who had united the Finnish tribes and was pushing westward, burning settlements and taking thralls, leaving nothing but scorched earth in his wake. Most men spoke of Ulfar with fear. Bjorn heard only opportunity. He found Ulfar's trail in the ruins of a Norwegian coastal village. The destruction was absolute. Longhouses reduced to charred skeletons, bodies left unburied for the crows, the smell of death thick enough to choke on. Bjorn studied the carnage with a warrior's eye, reading the story written in blood and ash. Ulfar's force was large, perhaps 300 men, well-disciplined and utterly ruthless. They had come in the night, overwhelmed the village's meager defenses in minutes, killed everyone who resisted, and enslaved everyone who didn't. The few survivors Bjorn found hiding in the hills spoke of Ulfar himself, a giant of a man who wielded a great bearded axe and wore a necklace of human finger bones. He had laughed as he'd burned the village chief alive, had made the man's wife watch before taking her as a thrall. Bjorn followed Ulfar's warband for 3 weeks, tracking them through the snow-blind wilderness like a wolf following caribou. He learned their patterns, their routines, the way they posted guards and selected campsites. He learned that Ulfar was more than just a raider. The man was building something, forging the Finnish tribes into an army with dreams of conquest, of carving out a kingdom in the frozen north. And he learned that Ulfar kept his greatest treasures in a heavily guarded wagon at the center of his camp, tribute from a dozen destroyed villages, gold and silver and amber, worth a small kingdom's ransom. The idea came to Bjorn like a vision from the gods. If he could steal Ulfar's treasure and return it to Hjaltland, if he could bring back enough wealth to restore what the clan had lost at Ravensborg and more besides, perhaps his exile could end. Perhaps he could look Astrid in the eyes again. Perhaps Freya might forgive him. It was madness, of course, 1 man against 300, but Bjorn had stopped caring about survival. He cared only about meaning, about making his death count for something, if death was all that remained to him. He waited for the right moment, the perfect alignment of circumstance and luck. It came on a night when Ulfar's warband camped beside a frozen river, exhausted from a long march, their guards lazy with cold and boredom. Bjorn moved like a ghost through the darkness, his father's sword across his back, Eric's wooden box pressed against his heart. He killed the first sentry with a knife to the kidney, lowering the man silently into the snow. The second died with Bjorn's hand over his mouth, choking on his own blood. The third had time to cry out, but by then Bjorn was already at the treasure wagon, cutting the oxen free, sending them stampeding through the camp in a chaos of bellowing and trampling hooves. The camp erupted. Warriors stumbled from their tents, confused and disoriented, grabbing for weapons. Bjorn drove the treasure wagon toward the river, whipping the horses into a frenzy, the heavy wheels bouncing over frozen ground. Behind him, men shouted and torches flared. Arrows hissed past his head. He reached the river and didn't hesitate, drove the wagon straight onto the ice, praying to gods he half believed in that it would hold. The ice groaned, cracked, but held. He made it halfway across before he heard the thundering of hooves behind him. Ulfar himself led the pursuit, mounted on a huge black stallion, his face twisted with rage. A dozen riders followed, their horses foaming, their weapons bright in the moonlight. Bjorn abandoned the wagon and ran, sprinting for the far shore, his breath burning in his lungs, his legs screaming. He almost made it. Then the ice beneath him gave way with a sound like the world breaking, and he plunged into water so cold it stopped his heart. The shock was absolute, beyond pain, beyond cold, a violence that ripped the air from his lungs and filled his mouth with the taste of his own death. The current seized him, dragged him under the ice, spun him in darkness. He clawed for the surface, for light, for air, but found only more darkness, more cold. His fingers went numb, his thoughts fragmented. He saw Eric's face, pale and accusing, saw Astrid turning away, saw his father's disappointment written in the stars. Then hands grabbed him, hauled him up through a hole in the ice, dragged him onto the shore. He lay gasping like a fish, his body convulsing, ice forming in his beard and hair. Through the blur of his vision, he saw faces, not Ulfar's warriors, someone else. A woman's voice, speaking words he didn't understand. Then darkness took him, and he knew nothing. He woke to firelight and pain. His body was wrapped in furs, his frozen clothes removed, his skin rubbed raw by rough hands trying to force warmth back into him. He was in a small hut, the walls made of stacked stone and turf, the roof low and smoke-blackened. The woman who had saved him sat nearby, old and weathered as driftwood, her eyes sharp as broken glass. She spoke in a dialect he barely understood, something between Norwegian and Finnish, but he caught the meaning. She had seen him fall through the ice, had pulled him out because the gods had told her to, because he had a debt yet unpaid. For 3 days he lay fevered and delirious, his body fighting to survive, even as his mind wandered through the halls of the dead. In his dreams, Eric came to him, not accusing but sad, unbearably sad. "You cannot die yet, father," the boy said. "Your saga is not finished. Mine ended too soon, but yours must continue. You must return. You must make my death mean something." When Bjorn woke on the 4th day, his fever broken, he found that the old woman had retrieved the wooden box from his clothes. It sat beside his bed, unopened but waiting. Recovery was slow and agonizing. The cold had damaged him in ways he didn't fully understand. His hands trembled constantly, His joints ached like they were filled with ground glass, but the old woman nursed him with herbs and bitter teas, and slowly, reluctantly, his strength returned. She told him her name was Ragnar, that she had been a Volva once, a Seerts, before age had taken her sight beyond the veil. She had no family, no clan. She lived alone on the edge of the wilderness, taking fish from the river, tending a small garden in the brief summer months, waiting for death with the patience of stones. Ragnar asked him why he had tried to steal from Ulfar. Bjorn told her everything: the raid, Eric's death, his exile, his desperate need for redemption. She listened without judgment, her ancient face unreadable. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said, "You seek to buy back honor with gold, but honor cannot be bought. It can only be earned through right action, through sacrifice that asks nothing in return. Your son did not die for glory or for treasure. He died because you sent him to. That is the truth you must carry. And the only way to honor his memory is to stop trying to erase what happened and instead to live in a way that makes his sacrifice meaningful." Her words broke something in Bjorn that had been cracking since Eric's death. He wept then, for the first time since the funeral pyre, great racking sobs that tore through him like storms. He wept for his son, for his wife, for his daughter, for the man he'd been and the man he'd become. Ragnar held him as he shattered, this stranger who owed him nothing, and in her arms he felt something he hadn't felt since leaving Hildland, the possibility of forgiveness, not from others but from himself. Spring came slowly to the north. The ice broke on the river, the snows retreated, the world turned green again. Bjorn stayed with Ragnar through the thaw, helping her plant her garden, repair her roof, cut wood for the next winter. He learned that Ulfar's warband had searched for him for weeks after his escape, had found the treasure wagon broken on the ice, had given him up for dead when they couldn't find his body. The warlord had moved on, continuing his march westward, leaving destruction in his wake. The treasure was lost to the river, scattered across the bottom like so many worthless stones. Bjorn felt no regret about the lost gold. Ragnar had been right. Gold could not restore what he had broken. Only actions could do that, and only if those actions were undertaken without expectation of reward or redemption. He began to understand that his exile was not a punishment to be endured until he could return home. It was a transformation he had to undergo, a death of his old self so that something new could be born. News came in late spring from a traveling merchant. Hildland was in trouble. A rival clan, sensing weakness in Bjorn's absence, had begun raiding their borders, stealing cattle, burning outlying farms. Arn Blackeye was a capable warrior, but an uncertain leader, and the clan was fracturing under pressure, old feuds resurfacing, unity crumbling. They needed help. They needed someone who could unite them, lead them, restore their strength. They needed a jarl, and they had none. Bjorn knew he had to return. Not because his exile was over, not because he had paid his debt, but because his people needed him, and he had a responsibility to them that transcended his personal shame. Ragnar understood before he spoke. She packed him provisions, gave him her blessings, told him to walk the path of right action rather than the path of pride. He promised her he would. He didn't know if he could keep that promise, but he would try. The journey home took 6 weeks. Bjorn traveled openly now, not as an exile, but as a man returning to claim his responsibilities. He did not go straight to Hildland. Instead, he sought out the rivals who were raiding his clan's borders. He went alone, unarmed except for a white branch of peace, and walked into their hall in the middle of their feast. The rival jarl, a man named Sigurd Ironbeard, could have killed him where he stood. Instead, Sigurd listened as Bjorn spoke. He offered no threats, no bribes, no appeals to honor or tradition. He simply told the truth, that he had failed his people, that they were suffering because of his failure, that he had no right to ask for mercy but was asking anyway, for their sake rather than his own, that if Sigurd needed someone to blame, someone to punish, Bjorn would accept that punishment willingly if it meant peace for both clans. Sigurd was moved by Bjorn's honesty in a way that threats never would have moved him. He proposed a settlement. The raids would stop immediately. In exchange, Hjaltland would provide Sigurd's clan with grain during the next harvest, and Bjorn would foster Sigurd's youngest son for 2 years, teaching the boy the ways of war and leadership. It was a fair arrangement, more generous than Bjorn had any right to expect. He accepted immediately. He reached Hjaltland on a summer evening when the sun hung low over the western sea, painting the world in shades of amber and gold. The village had not changed, yet everything was different. He walked through the gates expecting nothing, asking for nothing. The villagers stared at him in shock, uncertainty, fear. Then Thorvald Greybeard stepped forward, his ancient face unreadable. The silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Bjorn knelt before the old warrior, removed his cloak, bared his neck. "I have returned," he said quietly, "not to reclaim what I lost, but to serve as I should have served before. I bring no treasure, no easy answers. I bring only the truth of my failure and the promise that I will spend what remains of my life trying to be worthy of the second chance I do not deserve. If you will have me, I will fight for this clan until my last breath. If you will not, I will accept your judgment and leave in peace." Thorvald studied him for a long moment. Then the old man reached out and pulled Bjorn to his feet. "We have had enough of pride," Thorvald said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yours and ours. It is time for wisdom. It is time for healing. Welcome home, Bjorn. Ironhand, not as our jarl, but as our brother. Let us rebuild together what we all broke." Astrid came to him that night, entering his chamber as she had before he left, her face no longer carved from ice, but from something softer, more human, more hurt. They did not speak at first. Words felt inadequate, fragile. Instead, she took his hand and placed it over her heart. Let him feel it beating, that stubborn rhythm of life continuing despite everything. "I cannot forgive you yet," she whispered. "Perhaps I never will, but I can walk beside you. I can try to build something new from these ruins, for Freya, if not for us." Freya remained distant, her pain too fresh, her trust too thoroughly broken, but she did not turn away when Bjorn approached her. She listened when he spoke. She accepted the wooden box when he offered it to her, told her it contained pieces of Eric that he had carried across half the world, that her brother had been brave and strong, and that his death was Bjorn's burden to carry, not hers. She held the box against her chest and Bjorn cried with her, and it was a beginning, however small, however fragile. The silver arm ring remained with Arnim Blackeye. Bjorn did not ask for its return. Instead, he proposed something different, a council of elders who would rule together, sharing power and responsibility, making decisions through consensus rather than the will of a single jarl. It was an unusual arrangement, almost unheard of among the Norse clans. But these were unusual times, and desperate measures had become necessary. The council agreed to try, and slowly, painfully, Hjaltland began to heal. Bjorn spent his days working alongside the farmers, rebuilding what the raids had destroyed, teaching the young warriors not the glory of battle, but the weight of responsibility, the cost of pride, the value of restraint. He honored his agreement with Sigurd, fostered the man's son with care and wisdom, built bridges where before there had been only enmity. He carved a memorial stone for Eric and the others who had fallen at Ravensborg, not celebrating their deaths but acknowledging his role in causing them. He made no excuses, offered no justifications, simply accepted the truth and tried to do better. Years passed. Bjorn's hair turned grey, his body grew stiff with old wounds and older regrets. But something in him had changed, had tempered in the fire of his failure, and emerged not harder, but more flexible, not stronger, but wiser. He never stopped missing Eric, never stopped carrying the guilt of his son's death. But he learned to live with that weight, to let it inform his choices rather than define them. He learned that redemption was not a destination but a direction, a path walked one difficult step at a time. On the 10th anniversary of Eric's death, Bjorn climbed the black cliffs where his son's funeral pyre had burned. The wind still screamed across the rocks, cold and merciless, but Bjorn no longer heard it as fury. He heard it as a reminder, a voice from the gods or from the earth itself, telling him that life continued, that the world moved forward regardless of individual suffering, that meaning was found not in avoiding pain, but in choosing how to carry it. He stood at the cliff's edge, the wooden box in his hands, and spoke to Eric as if the boy could hear him across the veil that separated the living from the dead. He told his son that he was sorry, that he would always be sorry, that no amount of time or good deeds could erase what had happened, but he also told Eric that his death had not been meaningless, that it had broken Bjorn in ways that needed breaking, had taught him lessons he could never have learned any other way, had ultimately made him into someone who could serve his people with humility rather than pride. Then, carefully, reverently, Bjorn opened the box and removed Eric's childhood treasures. The tooth, the lock of hair, the wooden sword. He held each item for a moment, remembering the boy who had owned them, the laughter that was now silence, the future that would never be. And then, one by one, he released them to the wind, let them scatter across the cliffs and the sea, let them return to the world that had made them. It was not forgetting, not abandoning. It was letting go, acknowledging that Eric belonged to the past now, to memory and saga, and that Bjorn had to live in the present, had to honor his son, not by clinging to relics, but by becoming the man Eric had deserved as a father. As the last piece disappeared into the wind, Bjorn felt something shift inside him, some final tether loosening, some last weight lifting. He would carry Eric's memory forever, would speak the boy's name in prayers, and tell his stories to grandchildren not yet born, would make sure that his son was remembered, not just for his death, but for the brief, bright life he had lived. But he would not be crushed by that memory anymore. He would not let his guilt consume him. He would walk forward into whatever years remained, doing what good he could, making what amends were possible, accepting that some debts could never be fully paid, but still had to be acknowledged. The sun set over the western sea, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and Bjorn Ironhand turned away from the cliff's edge and walked back toward the village, toward the people who needed him, toward the life that waited even for broken men who learned to mend themselves one scar at a time.